Hello and welcome to Williams Mullins Benefits Companion, a podcast that helps employers navigate the complex legal challenges of managing their employee benefit plans. I'm your host, Bryden DeWitt, and today I'm delighted to welcome back Sarah Parker, Director of Retirement Plan Consulting at Sageview Advisory Group. Welcome back to the Benefits Companion, Sarah.
Thank you for having me again.
Sarah, in a podcast posted a few months ago, we discussed President Trump's executive order 14330, regarding alternative investments in ERISA retirement plans, such as private equity and cryptocurrency. And at the time, you provided a lot of good insights, but our position was the Department of Labor has to issue guidance before employers really can know what to do. And in fact, the executive order directed the Department of Labor to issue guidance. And now, these several months later, we finally have proposed regulations from the Department of Labor. They were issued on March 31, 2026. Again, these are proposed regulations, but providing guidance for plan fiduciaries regarding investment in alternative investments. Sarah, first, can you just provide some background and overview on the recent proposed regulations and what led up to this guidance? What does this proposal accomplish?
Yes. So very quickly, kind of taking you back, in 2020, under the first Trump administration, there was a pretty big push for alternative investments inside of kind of a diversified asset allocation within retirement plans. And then in 2025, the Biden administration kind of rescinded that. And then, as you kind of did an overview there of our last podcast, this kind of came back around in August of last year with this executive order. And really the goal was kind of democratizing access to alternative assets. And so we were all really eagerly awaiting, what's the guideline here? And the industry was really grappling with, are we going to be able to put private markets really into retirement plans? And we're talking about participant-directed plans here this time. And so what we got from the proposal here at the end of March was a very interesting departure from, I think, what we were expecting. And so it kind of took the executive order and turned it into really more of a duty of prudence when selecting any designated investment alternative for a participant-directed plan.
Right.
So it didn't exactly address alternatives. It more or less kind of addressed overall investment process and fiduciary prudence in selecting any investment alternative.
So the proposed regulations provide a 6-factor safe harbor that if fiduciaries follow these 6 factors, they are deemed to meet the prudence standard. How should plan fiduciaries respond to these proposed regulations and the new 6-factor test, if you will?
Yeah, so one of the things that this proposal is putting forth is ultimately kind of outlining a safe harbor process when you're making investment selection as a fiduciary. And the 6-part factor test that you brought up is for the first time, we've really seen them kind of outline steps on how to select investments. And so those 6, and I'll try to be very brief and to the point, but they're performance, fees, liquidity, valuation, benchmarking, and complexity. A couple of those are probably kind of trying to answer some of the alternative question, but maybe I'll just walk through each one very quickly. So performance is looking at what they want to do is kind of assist fiduciaries and saying that you need to look at performance, but risk-adjusted performance. You need to look at it across multiple time periods. And so you would think that that's ingrained in a lot of processes for investment advisors, but keep in mind this was written for those that might not have an investment advisor as well. With fees, it specifically states that you need to be looking at comparisons before hiring an investment option. Look at fees of others. You don't have to just offer the lowest cost. What they want to see here is the following of a process, which we agree with 100%, in that sometimes the lowest cost is not always the best option. Liquidity, it needs to be able to meet the liquidity demands of participants, because keep in mind, participants can redeem at any time from a participant-directed plan. So you have to take that into account. Can they handle the flows of your plan? Valuation. This one kind of gets into alternatives in the fact that alternatives sometimes are not priced daily. In fact, most of them are not. And so really what this factor is meant to do is make sure that your record keeper can handle the valuation of the investment that you're about to select. So most mutual funds are daily priced, but some of them you just have to be careful and make sure that that's a check in your process. Benchmarking is interesting. That's kind of the fifth component because they didn't go into detail on the types of benchmarks. They didn't say anything about peer benchmarking, but they did say you need to have a meaningful benchmark. And so that's interesting because that is something that hasn't been said before. Again, a lot of consulting firms or investment advisors follow that as part of their process, but also kind of getting to, if you want to think about putting in an alternative, think about how you're going to benchmark it. And then complexity. You have to be able to understand, they want you to be able to understand as a fiduciary the type of investment. It's got to be appropriate for your skill level. So really what they're saying there is if your investment committee or your benefits committee overseeing these investments has never heard the term private equity before, maybe that wouldn't be appropriate. So they're meant to be vague enough where it could be applicable to any investment that you might be considering for a participant directed plan.
So, as I recall, before the Trump executive order, that was meant to sweep away the obstacles from prior Department of Labor guidance.
Mhm.
Part of that prior guidance under the Biden administration, the warnings from the Department of Labor about alternative investments, private equity,
Mhm.
cryptocurrency, one was liquidity,
Yeah.
one was valuation, and another was complexity. And so these regulations in response to the executive order are supposed to comply with the executive order to democratize alternative investments. But if I'm a fiduciary and I'm looking at these factors, it is taking me back to the pre-Trump guidance, but now in proposed regulations. I just find that interesting that
Yeah.
we can't really get away from the realities of alternative investments.
Well,
And
that's exactly right. They're not saying you can't do it. They're saying you have to follow this process and you have to be able to justify each one of these
right.
factors. Now,
But it's kind of reiterating the prior guidance that the Trump order was supposed to sweep away.
exactly. I think more than anything, when I read this proposal, which I know is just a proposal at this stage, but I see it more as following a prudent decision-making process in order to kind of support that presumption of prudence and to kind of help a little bit with some of the litigation concerns. But it really is very much meant to be vague. And so I think it would be very difficult to ever rescind a proposal like this since it is so broad.
Right. So given this guidance, how are you thinking about adding alternative investments to 401k plan investment options?
Well, let's be clear. I have two different hats. I have kind of the investor hat, and then I have, the
Right.
fiduciary hat.
Right.
Private markets are excellent investment options. They can add wealth, they can create extensive opportunities for investors to get into industries, get exposure to different areas, very creative. And so we're very supportive of private markets. Unfortunately, though, in a 401k or a 403b plan, we are not using this proposal as a stamp of approval from the Department of Labor, and we will not be recommending private markets in 401k or 403b plans at this time. Not because we don't believe in them, but because, just quite frankly, they're not going to pass these factors. And it's just still a little too early in kind of where we are in introducing and moving these into participant directed plans. Now that being said, they can still be part of a diversified portfolio, such as in a managed account. And we do have some solutions there for participants or employers that want to really offer kind of initial exposure through a managed account. We still think it needs to be appropriately handled and the risk parameters around it need to be a little bit more robust, meaning you can't just offer it as a core investment option.
So under these six factors, and you mentioned that fees, you don't have to choose the lowest fee. How do you frame when you're advising committees, the fee versus value conversation?
Yeah. So, the biggest thing when you're going through an investment alternative search and you're looking at the different fees is you always have to look at the returns net of the fees. And you also have to take into account that excess return that those managers are generating. So what I mean by that is if someone has a slightly higher fee, but their return and their risk profile is more attractive, well, it warrants a little bit more in the fee, right? Sometimes if somebody's doing a better job, they can justify getting paid a little bit more. And so that's the way we see it. We see it as sometimes if we're presenting three options and the one that we recommend is maybe middle of the road, maybe it's not the cheapest, maybe it's not the most expensive, but everything else, all the other factors are high quality and excel relative to the other two options, that would be the one we would recommend. So we look at different characteristics and qualitative and quantitative.
So, as you know, and for listeners, there are kind of two types of fiduciaries that provide investment advice or management for 401k plans and ERISA retirement plans. You have 321 investment advisors who
Mhm.
merely provide advice to the fiduciaries who make the decisions about plan investments. And then there are called ERISA Section 338 investment managers, and that's where fiduciaries outsource the decision making on investments to an investment manager. As all of this gets more complex, how do you see the role of 321 investment advisors and 338 investment managers evolving?
Yeah, I see the hiring of more 338
Yeah,
managers.
that's what I was thought you might
Yeah.
say.
Just because, just anytime there's a change or a new proposal, something new to learn, if this isn't your day job, I completely understand wanting to outsource it to someone that's staying on top of these factors and understands these six factors. I think if a fiduciary or someone sitting on a committee and they're working with a 321 advisor and we start to review these six factors with them, which by the way, we're going to, and we're going to make sure that we're using a lot of the same language from going forward that the Department of Labor is using. If they get a little kind of turned off by some of this terminology and feeling like they need to understand it, I can very much see them saying, you know what, we're gonna outsource a little bit more to our investment advisor. And
I agree. I see that too. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for coming on to the Benefits Companion and working through these issues with us.
yeah, thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
That wraps up this episode of the Benefits Companion. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact me. You can also visit our employee benefits page at williamsmullen.com/employee benefits. There you can find out more about our team, as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. Finally, be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening.
This podcast contains general condensed summaries of actual legal matters, statutes, and opinions for information purposes. It is not meant to be and should not be construed as legal advice. Individuals with particular needs on specific issues should retain our services or the services of other competent counsel.